So, in the following tutorial, I'd like to show you how to apply plaster pattern over a large area. I have this large chunk of plaster that I want to represent on the Roman fresco I'm working on at Luxor Temple. And obviously, if I would use our traditional Chicago method and would draw it by hand, it would take probably hours to complete the plaster pattern over such large area. So we want to avoid that. So let me just quickly select and delete this area and go back to our digital pattern and how to apply it. First of all, of course, I'm gonna use the plaster dot brush stroke, which is 7 pixels wide at 1200 dpi, and quickly draw an outline to encircle the area that I'm gonna use the plaster pattern on. And I'm not gonna be super careful following my pencil lines for this demonstration because I don't want us to get ages to finish this tutorial video, and I wanna emphasize the more important parts of how to apply the plaster pattern. So let me just quickly encircle this area. As you can see, I'm not using the continuous outline what the regular Chicago method uses for Chicago house drawings, because for the Roman fresco I want to make sure that plaster stays as much as it's possible in the background. So I'm using an outline with little gaps in between chunks of the outline to distinguish it from continuous lines that I use for other portions of the fresco. So as you can see now, we have this large area here encircled, and I'm gonna zoom in and jump right into using my plaster pattern. As you can see, I zoom to about 50%. That seems like a good zoom level for applying the plaster pattern. You don't want to zoom in too much because then you get lost in the details, and you don't want to zoom out too much either because then you lose control over your line. So 50% seems like a good start here, and I'm using Astropad for tethering my Photoshop to my iPad for this demonstration, so I hope that it's not gonna be too stuttering for showing the process. I will choose a relatively large brush stroke for the plaster pattern, and of course once I move to the patterns, my pattern library has already the plaster and the plaster dots patterns that we just created for this tutorial. So let me just start with this 80 pixels wide plaster brush and add a quick layer of plaster over the darkest areas of my texture. You have to make sure that you disable alignment for applying the pattern, which allows you to go over and over areas to make them darker. Of course, this would be too much, so let me just quickly roll back to my original and start adding more and more to the areas, to the dark areas. As you can see, I'm pretty casual about putting down these first patches because I know that I don't want to overdo it, and I want to be able to add more of the texture and refine it later on. So I completely ignore lighter areas like this one right here, and then just add the the pattern to the darkest portions of the background. I'm not going to do the entire surface for this demonstration. I just want you to get the idea of how it's done. Once I have this first layer applied over the surface, my next move is going to be to change to plaster dots, and which doesn't have the circles. It only has the dots, of course, the dots part. And then I'll switch to a smaller brush, let's say 30-ish pixels, and then I start adding more dots to these darkest details. It's very important for the process because this gives you the right amount of detail that you need to make this plaster reflect to the actual surface and not just generate a plaster, a regular plaster that doesn't reflect to the actual situation. So as you can see, these little cracks in the plaster are very good candidates for some detail. So I'm adding these dots to this area. It's important not to do these fine details with the actual plaster pattern, because then you won't be able to give it as much control as you'd love to, and then you might end up adding half circles instead of full circles, or too intense, too dense areas, and then you'd have to erase a lot at the end. So as you can see, very quickly I'm adding more and more to these little features. And once I say, wow, this is actually starting to reflect to the actual surface, I'm going to start taking over by hand. Zoom in a little bit further, switch to the brush, and then maybe in areas where there is no pattern but very light surface needs to be added, I just add a few circles here and there, or if I feel that it's too intense, I could just take out a few dots or circles and then add new ones. So this helps me to get into the details wherever it's necessary, take out chunks if I feel like I should have less circles or less of a pattern here and there. And it's actually universally true for any pattern you apply, that basically this is how you work. You start with a large pattern, you put on just a very thin layer of the actual pattern, then you refine it with a version of the pattern that's less detailed, or refine it by hand, or with the combination of both. And then once you're done and satisfied, you go ahead, disable the background, and check your result and see if you zoom out, if it gives you a clear indication of the actual surface. This can go both ways. You can look at it without the background and see if it makes sense as a three-dimensional surface, or you can actually add the background and then sort of zoom in a little bit, go to your plaster layer, and then by clicking it on and off, it's a pretty good visual feedback for you to see if what you can see on the photo actually is reflected on the drawing. So basically, this is how I create plaster patterns for larger surfaces, larger areas. And as you can see, for such large drawings, it's actually a pretty time-consuming, pretty time-saving method to not to get dragged down by certain features of the drawing.